The history of heavy.
Hello and welcome to the History of Heavy podcast. I almost said the Huntsman Hill Polanco podcast. That is the old podcast. This is the current and new-ish podcast, The History of Heavy. This is a show that traces the chronology of heavy music across genres, song by song. As always, I am your host, Michael Huntsman, and alongside me virtually is my dear pal, Dave Lieberman. Hey, Dave.
Virtually a dear pal.
You are virtually a dear pal, and here we are so quickly already at episode 7, man. Here we're chugging right along.
Making good time.
Yeah, you know, we decided the show was going to be weekly. Trying to keep episodes at around 30 minutes. We've done a pretty decent job of that so far. I've been excited, a little look behind the curtain. I've been excited that we're actually ahead of the game. We're kind of banking these, but a couple of weeks before, a few weeks before they're actually going to come out. I'm like, oh man, we're cruising through this. We've got a list of songs we're gonna do, and before we know it, we're gonna be talking about the current Blood Incantation record, which I love, which is about 130 episodes from now, and I realized it's gonna be a couple of years before we get to that, given our current clip of once a week. But regardless, I am excited to be on this journey, my friend.
I'm glad to be your virtual companion.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Tonight we are going to talk about the 13th Floor Elevators and their classic song, "You're Gonna Miss Me," from 1966. And it's a jam, and I'm excited to talk to you about it. But before we talk about the Elevators or Roky Erickson or the song "You're Gonna Miss Me," we're going to talk about 1966 itself. And the way we do that is via Dave's Cultural Corner.
Dave's Cultural!
Welcome to my corner. We already did the first half of 1966 in our last episode, so we're going to pick it up in July. July 29th, Bob Dylan is injured in a motorcycle accident near his home in Woodstock, New York. He is not seen in public for over a year. August 5th, the Caesars Palace Hotel and Casino opens in Las Vegas, United States. August 11th, the Beatles hold a press conference in Chicago during which John Lennon apologizes for his "more popular than Jesus" remark, saying, and I'm not going to do a
Liverpoolian accent.
Liverpoolian accent. I didn't mean it as a lousy anti-religious thing. Very John Lennon. August 29th, the Beatles end their U.S. tour with a concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. It is their last performance as a live touring band. October 6th, LSD is made illegal in the United States and controlled so strictly that not only are possession and recreational use criminalized, but all legal scientific research programs on the drug in the country are shut down as well. Also that day, the Love Pageant rally takes place in the panhandle of Golden Gate Park, which is a narrow section that projects into San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. October 15th, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton found the Black Panther Party in the United States. October 27th, Walt Disney records his final filmed appearance prior to his death, detailing his plans for Epcot, a utopian plan to be in Florida. November 28th, Truman Capote's Black and White Ball, the party of the century, is held in New York City. And we're going to end with the holidays. December 26th, the first Kwanzaa is celebrated by Maulana Karenga, founder of Organization US, a Black national chair of Black Studies at California State University, Long Beach, from 1989 to 2002. Oh, the last thing is not dated, but somber. In or about this year, one person returning from Haiti from the Congo is thought to have first brought HIV to the Americas, 1967.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. I had no idea. It was that much prior to the epidemic. That's wild.
Yeah, it took a minute to get to epidemic state, and it took a long time to really be recognized as such. It's got its own very interesting history, and I would encourage people to educate themselves on it. There's a lot of lessons to be learned there, but there you go.
Yeah. You mentioned Dylan, Bob Dylan, not somebody we will be talking about extensely on the History of Heavy podcast. Bob Dylan's
maybe
great.
Not directly, but indirectly,
Right.
He touches things.
Yeah, it touches a lot of things. Have you seen the movie, A Complete Unknown, the current film?
I've not seen it yet. No.
I'm pretty anti-biopic, but it's a good one. It's good, and
That's a strong endorsement.
Yeah, I was pretty impressed by it. It's funny. The thing, my issue with the biopics is I don't like. It's specifically music biopics. Is I don't like watching people imitate musicians that I love because I'd rather just watch the actual musicians. So the Dylan stuff, except when he's performing, is great. When Timothy Chalamet is performing as Bob Dylan, well, I'd rather just watch Bob Dylan. But I digress. I bring it up just because we've talked a lot about, and this show is an example of just deep music deep dives. I went on a deep Dylan kind of discography deep dive over the last couple of weeks, which I hadn't done in a long time, and started with Jesus Christ. Not the Free Will and Bob Dylan. What's the one before that? Oh, I guess it is the Free Will and Bob Dylan, because the one before that self-titled. So I started with the second record and went all the way through Time Out of Mind, which is 1990 whatever. I cherry picked, but listen to 12 different records. Jesus Christ, dude. It's so good. Those records are so fucking good. So deep endorsement for Bob Dylan on this show. But
Dylan discography deep dive, I think, is your next podcast. I'm not qualified for that one, but my gift to you.
That would be an endeavor. But not tonight. Tonight, we are here to talk about the 13th floor elevators, who I always refer to as the 13 floor elevators for whatever reason. So forgive me if I do that throughout this show. For those not familiar with this band, they were a garage rock band, loosely described, from Austin, Texas. They were formed in 1965 by guitarist and vocalist Roky Erickson, electric jug player Tommy Hall, and guitarist Stacy Sutherland, all while they were still in their late teens. As being the first ever to be identified as psychedelic rock, a term credited, in fact, to Tommy Hall, their electric jug player, for those keeping up. And honestly, I think the best description of what the band is, I think it best classifies their music. I would certainly call the Elevators psychedelic rock. So I think that's great. As the band was developing, very early in their career, Janis Joplin, also an Austin, Texas native, considered joining the band, but instead was persuaded to go to San Francisco, where she, of course, found major fame. And we will be talking about Ms. Joplin on a future episode of this very show, although not Dylan, but Janis for sure. In January of 1966, shortly after she opted not to join the band, the Elevators would go to Houston to record their first ever single, which would give them a record deal. Become their first debut single, their most recognizable song, and their only song ever to chart. That song is tonight's topic, You're Gonna Miss Me. Released as a single on January 17th in 1966, and later appearing as the lead track on their debut album, The Psychedelic Sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators. The song was composed by Erickson when he was just 15 years old and became hugely influential on emerging genres and genres to come, including the aforementioned garage rock and psychedelic rock, but also acid rock and punk rock, certainly. The Elevators have been cited as a major influences on acts as disparate as REM, ZZ Top, Primal Scream, and the Jesus and Mary Chain, all of whom appear on a very good Roky Erickson tribute album called Where the Pyramid Meets the Eye. I highly recommend people check that out. And Dave, all of those bands are great, but none would necessarily be described as heavy. Now 7 episodes into this show, this is a question I always ask with a bit of a squint in my eyes because heavy is still a little blurry for a lot of this music we've talked about so far. So as it pertains to You're Gonna Miss Me, what is the significance of that song in your mind in the canon of heavy? And what is your history with the Elevators and this song in general, kind of over the years? This is the band you know or familiar with?
This is another one where my relationship is about a week deep, and I got to know them through researching and prepping for this podcast episode. The question of, is this song heavy in the pantheon of our conversation, is one that I'm going to put back to you in just a minute, because in my learning about this band, a couple things occurred to me. First of all, electric jug, what even is that, right? And okay, there is a very distinct, like there's this very strange sound that is I've never heard before or since, that is that electric jug. You can hear it. I didn't know what it would be like, and when I was confronted with it, I'm like, there it is. Like, there's no question about it. Is this song heavy? I'm going to say no, and I'm going to say no especially because as I let the album play, the next song is heavy. The next song is heavy. Like, everything after this song gets slowed down and a little darker. The subject matter is darker. The tone of the music is a little more sinister. But this song was their single, their hit, what made them known. So again, it is in our conversation. It doesn't have to be in its native landscape. It's not in its native landscape. It's in our terrarium, right? It's in our little zoo or menagerie. So yeah, it's definitely important for our discussion because of the psychedelic pioneer in they were pioneers in this concept of psychedelic rock, and because they actually have a body of work that is heavy. It's just that this is the doorway into this band and their sound and their importance on our timeline.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put it back to you. Talk to us about your picking this song for its heaviness and how it's heavy to you.
Yeah, one of the more fun exercises, this podcast was long gestating before we actually started recording, and talking. We've talked about it for a long time, but well before we talked about it, I had this idea in my head to do this. And one of the things that was so fun and continues to be fun about it is laying out a timeline of songs and figuring out which songs I wanted to cherry pick to represent this idea of the weight of songs and the heaviness that would grow and become more intense over the years and the decades. And a lot of songs, just last week we talked about, last week we talked about Coltrane. The week before that, we talked about the Stones. There's some debate as to whether not only was that the right song, but are the Stones even heavy? And you can go back and listen to that episode and hear that discussion. And I think it's a fair question for the Elevators in this song too. This is a band that I came to very late. Knew this song kind of in my peripheral vision, I guess. Didn't know who it was for most of my life, and only kind of deep dove on these guys, I don't know, 10 years ago or whatever it's been now, but pretty recently. As kind of one of the gaps in my listening history, and I'm like, oh, that's one of the, I have a list of bands. It's like, oh, they're important, so I got to hear them, or they're important, or whatever. So got to them, some years back, and love them, and love that record, and love a lot of Rocky's work post, a lot of his solo stuff. Just a really talented, kind of crazy guy. And when putting this together, the song came to mind, and there are really two elements that made me want to include not only the band but this song, and I think it fits nicely at this point in our now 6.5 episode deep conversation, and that is, to me, there are two things that make this song heavy that we haven't really gotten into yet, as in terms of elements that make a song heavy. The first is the vocal. There is Rocky sings with a real kind of a squeal, almost a desperation. The Witch by the Sonics certainly has some of that,
Yes.
but most of the other songs we've talked about so far do not. Definitely an element of garage rock, would obviously be an element of punk rock. But I think in the context of heavy, I think that just the mania that he sings the song with, to me, is heavy and makes the song dark and desperate, and kind of shines a light on some of those dark corners we're trying to expose. The other thing that we haven't talked about any song yet, but we will talk about it now, and we will talk about it next week, certainly, and that is the bass guitar. Every instrument we've talked about so far as being the key contributor to its heaviness has been the guitar, with the exception of John Coltrane's saxophone. The guitar has been the thing the thing that has made the song heavy. Whether it was Link Wray or Dave Davies coming up ways to distort their sound, or the wickedly famous riff of Satisfaction, guitar. Got into saxophone last week. Now for a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about the bass and some other instrument. And I think that there is a throbbing heaviness. The bass is really pushed forward in the mix on this song. And there is sonically a low end to this song that most of the songs we've talked about so far do not have. And I think that's what we're starting to hear. We will certainly talk about it next week with Cream. We will talk about it the week after that with the Velvet Underground, where just tonally, forgetting what instruments it's played on, or even what they're playing, but the production and the tone of the records is starting to sound muddier and deeper, and I would argue heavier. So this song, you could play this song on an acoustic guitar or a banjo, and it would work perfectly great and wouldn't be heavy at all, and could be very poppy. But I think the performance, I don't think it's the song, I think it's the performance on You're Gonna Miss Me that makes it heavy.
Really great way to draw that, pull that thread all the way through. That bass is heavy. Bass has a weight that is deep, and that's going to come up in a bunch of stuff that we talk about, and it's something that I've always personally connected with, and we've talked about quite a bit. That's a great through line, and that certainly gets it on our map all by itself without any of the other commentary.
Yeah. Well, if you were to describe this song out of the context of this podcast, I talked about psychedelic rock and garage rock and punk rock and whatever. If you had to narrow it to a single genre, just considering the song without any context, what genre would you say You're Gonna Miss Me is?
This is garagey. This is garage rock the same way that Louie Louie is. And it has that same, it's really connected to that same era energy where it's still edgy and new and exploratory to be just adjacent to the mainstream. There's enough of a melody to connect with, but the vocals are a huge part of it. The energy is a huge part of it, and that makes it garagey for me. The bass brings it into our conversation, but to answer this question on the floor right now, Your Honor, I do solemnly swear garage rock.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the key elements of garage rock, we haven't talked about this yet, but I think it's an interesting way to think about heavy and how heavy will continue to develop over the years, is sloppiness versus technical precision. Sloppiness is typically punk rock, precision is typically metal. And the heaviness, so far we've mostly talked about sloppy. There's not a lot, from The Witch to Louie Louie to You're Gonna Miss Me. It's kind of, it feels like the wheels are gonna fall off any time, and a tradition that would go through, the MC5 and the Stooges and onto Nirvana and Mudhoney and, all kinds of bands that, were quote unquote sloppy in the greatest of ways, as opposed to just to think heavy, as opposed to what, King Crimson or Rush or Slayer or Metallica or even Black Sabbath would do. Where there's more, it's much more deliberate, it's much more controlled, it's much more precise. And I think sloppy, and the Stooges in particular, and one of my favorite bands of all time, and I'll be excited to talk about them in 15 episodes or whatever it is. The Stooges are kind of a great example. Sloppy, I think. Sloppy is often not sonically heavy, but attitudinally heavy, and I think that's where the Elevators kind of fit. Is sonically, again, that heaviness, and going back to Satisfaction, that heaviness isn't necessarily immediately identifiable, but the way it's performed, the attitude that it's performed with, the energy that it's performed with, and again, specifically on You're Gonna Miss Me, I think the production lends itself to this notion of heaviness that we've been talking about.
Sure. As you're talking about sloppiness, I don't want it to, connecting with it and want to make sure that it's not being portrayed as really a lack of control. But I think that you mean it in the way, and the way I'm receiving it is in the same framework as The Drunken Master. Are you familiar with Jackie Chan's Drunken Master?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It feels like that to me, right? Where it's this looseness, it's an absence of inhibition, an absence of structure, and an absence of constraints of structure and form. And in that absence, there's some freedom to move and find your own center and find your own balance. Mm-hmm. But there is a center and there is a balance. It's just, it's a flow that is finding its own way, and it is free from constraints that come before, or constraints that are like arbitrary. So it has that freedom to it. And I feel, and I'm hearing in sloppiness, not a lack of control, but a drunken master.
Yeah, that's good. I think it's also kind of an inhibition. It's the vocal miscue in Louie Louie and choosing to leave that in. That would never happen on a Metallica record.
It's rejecting those constraints. It's being free of those constraints and embracing the negative space of what is left when you color outside the lines and you're in that no man's zone, and then you own it. Right. You leave the vocal in there, you color outside the lines.
Yeah, I think coloring outside the lines is a really good way to think about it. I don't know, punk rock is obviously kind of top of mind as it relates to this song. And we have talked before about how punk rock isn't necessarily heavy, but it's kind of the comparison of the Ramones and the Sex Pistols. The Ramones, though not technically difficult, very precise. 1, 2, 3, 4, da 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 da. Very, very precise. The Pistols were kind of a ramshackle mess. And, Johnny's saying crap in the background. Sid's not able to, the whole thing. Both are amazing. Both are charming in their own ways, but very different animals too. The other part of it, certainly we get to 1966. Drugs are obviously a huge part of this. And we've talked about the difference between kind of weed bands and amphetamine bands. No, I can't say that word. To me, the Elevators are a little bit in the middle. And there's a
LSD is often cut with. I mean, it's cut with speed. Right, like it is in the middle. Like,
right. And I think there's gonna be and we should talk about booze too, because all three of those things, psychedelics, weed, and booze, will all be important kind of topics for us to talk on when we think about these different bands and these certain songs, and how that lends itself or not to being heavy.
Yeah.
I think,
well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, and the Elevators, I think, are to me, while their sound is clearly garage rock, I still very definitively think of them as a psychedelic rock band. And the psychedelics, I think, are important to the way they sound. But there is also a speediness and a kind of push the momentum forward energy to them that is speedy. So I think the path becomes a little interesting as it begins to diverge, and certainly as we talk about Cream and the Velvet Underground and Hendrix and Iron Butterfly and then ultimately the Beatles over the next 5 episodes, and how these different drugs influenced the heavy or not of the songs we're going to talk about. I just think it's an interesting way to frame this stuff.
And I want to tug on that a little bit more, because in the cultural corner, I talked about how LSD is made illegal, right? So now LSD was sort of just being played with, and some people, it was in the intellectual circle, and people were doing acid trips, like acid parties and stuff. Ken Kesey and the Merry
Acid
Pranksters.
Test. Yeah.
The Great Acid Test, right? There's all this stuff going on, and that's influencing the culture, and then it's illegal. Now it's counterculture, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the outsider we've talked about before. It's the rejection of the structure and the authority and the status quo. This is where they're making their own way and they're choosing their own things. And if it's the fact that it's kind of an outlaw behavior is co-opted or commingled with this. I don't think intentionally at this moment. I think it's coincidentally, but I really find it interesting that this is the album that is identified as the beginning of psychedelic rock at the moment when LSD is being shut off as it being defined as illegal. And so it's like, oh, really? Well, watch this, and that's such a heavy, for our conversation, way of approaching that moment.
That is really interesting. Yeah, this late 60s, early 70s period that we're about to dive into is super important in the context of heavy music, and drugs play a major role in all of that. What did you think of this song? Just personally.
Yeah, so more like interesting than connected to it. It sounds like the psychedelic 60s. So it makes sense to me that it is identified as a psychedelic album, psychedelic band, psychedelic song. It sounds like that. This could be in an Austin Powers movie. This could be
Probably is. Yeah.
Like it feels right that this is the sound. This is what the sound of the times sounded like to me. And we've talked about this other thing before, and I'm just gonna, spoiler alert a little bit with bringing the Beatles into this thread because they're in the news in my cultural corner. They're relevant. And I grew up with, my dad was a big Beatles fan, and so that was the music that I heard and connected to as a young kid first. And the thing that struck me as bonkers when I came to understand it later and look back on it was that listening to the Beatles music made me nostalgic for the 60s, which I never was a part of. And like, I didn't know, like, that was such a magical, powerful thing embedded in their music. And this did that to me. It made me feel nostalgic for this time period that I was not there for. I have no connection to, I have no memory of. It wasn't mine, but I feel nostalgic for it. Like I yearn for that in this nostalgic way that I miss it. How? I wasn't there, right? Like, how is that possible? So the Beatles was the first time that happened to me, and I unpacked that phenomenon much later. But I instantly found it when I listened to this song.
Huh. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, for whatever reason, the fact that the 13th Floor Elevators are from Austin makes me like them more than if they were just another San Francisco band.
Yeah.
And I really do not like the Grateful Dead. We've talked about our mutual dislike for that band and kind of what they represent and their fan base and whatever. I'm not a huge Janis Joplin fan. We'll talk about that in a few episodes. I did like the Jefferson Airplane, but a lot of that scene, I just could never really, I didn't like. I couldn't, the swinging 60s London that you talk about when you're thinking about the Beatles and Austin Powers is such a mile away from how granola and hippie, I mean, it was all hippie, but how granola and kind of gross barefoot the Haight-Ashbury was in my mind. And the fact that the Elevators were from Austin, there's something cooler about that to me. And it makes me, I think it made me want to deep dive into them in a way that I probably wouldn't if it was Big Brother and the Holding Company,
Yeah, I totally get that. And you just built a bridge I want to cross briefly before we close, which is that I got into a deep discussion with my wife about our Rolling Stones episode and how I made the point that it's not that I don't like the Stones, is that I dislike them. And when we dug down and unpacked that, it's because like I don't connect with the fans. And she's like, that's not fair. I'm like, yes, it is not fair. Like, and I want to be on record as acknowledging that it is not fair. They're great musicians. They're super successful. They've toured for millions of years. They get to have all the success that they get, and they get to do whatever they want. My lousy opinion is emotional and it's stupid, but it's an impulse that is happening from within that's coming out. I'm not thinking about it. It's happening to me. And what is music if it's not happening to you? Come on, right?
And so, you get to fan however you want to fan.
I reserve the right.
Right.
But it's a hard thing. It's a hard line to walk. And so I really just wanted to make that clear, which is I'm speaking out of my ass. Like this is just happening to me. It doesn't make sense. And it's okay that it doesn't make sense because music doesn't make sense. It's a feeling. And we can unpack it. We can make sense of it. We can write it down into a tablature or whatever, but it's a feeling.
Yeah.
So I just had to be on record.
That feeling is something that's been and will continue to be something that's very fun about this podcast. I know all of these songs that are on this list. Some obviously I know better than others. You don't necessarily know all of these songs. So getting a very honest, fresh reaction to some of these songs it makes for a fun conversation. It makes me rethink, well, why do I like this? Or why do I think it's good? Or why didn't I include it in the conversation? That will also happen next week, which is about a band that I have a little bit of a complicated relationship with. But before we get to that and the closing of the show, as always, we have to do Song v Song, which is where we pit last week's champion, which is kind of 3 weeks running are the champ for each of us. That is the aforementioned Witch by the Sonics. But now pitted against the 13th Floor Elevators, You're Gonna Miss Me. Sounds like I know where you stand, Dave, but what song are you gonna take forward to next week against Cream?
I'm taking the Witch, and it was not easy. I will say that. The thing that pushed me over the edge is that I just did not like the electric jug.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It
Fair
felt
enough.
weird. Now, given that I'm so new to this band and this sound, that could easily grow on me. I cannot tell you how long it took for me to get into Dinosaur Jr. It was a long time. The Smiths took a long time. Rush took a long time.
Sure.
But I dig those bands. Rush very bigly, and Dinosaur Jr., so that could have changed over time. But I am nothing if not honest, and that is my honest opinion, is the jug threw it off for this introduction to this band and this song, and the Witch is my champion one more week.
Well, I'd love to be the contrarian, but I can't be. I'm also taking the Witch forward. I love You're Gonna Miss Me. The Witch is a very special song to me, and that I didn't really realize when we started doing this that it would go this far for me. And looking at the lineup, it might last for a little bit for me. But we'll see how it does next week when we talk about Cream and Sunshine of Your Love, which I kind of have a lot to say about. So that will be a fun conversation.
I can't wait.
It'll be good. It'll be good. That's 1967. So we are moving forward in time very slowly to current day. So check that out next week. In the meantime, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check out our Spotify playlist where you will see every song we are going to talk about for 100 million weeks. And check us out on Instagram and Blue Sky. You can hit us up there with requests or suggestions. Thanks for listening. And as always, keep it heavy. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, thank you. Bye.